and welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for this session on human-wildlife coexistence in Africa. I'm Leandra Mers from the University of Florida, and today we have a few invited speakers who were unable to come, so that means we'll have extra time for the speakers who are here and plenty of time for questions and discussion at the end of the presentation. So you may submit questions for the speakers at any time during the presentation. Please use the Q&A button here in Zoom for your questions so that we can bring those up at the end during our discussion section. And please make sure to indicate to whom your question is addressed so we can keep track of that. And real quickly, I will introduce our speakers for today. We have a presentation by myself, another one by Akil Schersager from the University of Florida, and one by Tierney Shemansky, also from the University of Florida. So we will go ahead and turn our cameras off and mute ourselves so that you can watch our presentations, and we'll come back for a discussion after that. Thank you. Hi, I'm Leandra Mers, and my presentation is on the complexities of human-wildlife coexistence in Zambia's game management areas. Approximately 60% of global biodiversity is found outside of national parks, and indigenous groups are disproportionately responsible for managing land that is important for biodiversity conservation, yet lies outside of national parks. In Zambia, the game management areas, or GMAs, are designated for coexistence of humans and wildlife outside of national parks on communally owned land. In these GMAs, as well as across the world, human-wildlife conflict is increasingly common. And this just refers to any negative interactions between humans and wildlife. Human-wildlife conflict can result in economic losses, adverse human health impacts, or the decline of wildlife species. Wildlife tolerance refers to the willingness of individuals to accept the potential costs of living with wildlife, where costs can be predation, crop raiding, or human injury or death. Wildlife tolerance is highly complex and derived from a mixture of personal experiences, perceptions, attitudes, values, norms, and more. Yet conservationists often assume that it is based on a simple cost-benefit analysis. In order to promote coexistence of humans and wildlife in shared spaces such as GMAs, we need to better understand what shapes local people's tolerance of wildlife. So this research focuses on addressing tolerance for wildlife in one GMA within Zambia. I used the Mukungule GMA outside of North Luangwa National Park for my research. And North Luangwa National Park is particularly relevant for a few reasons. First and foremost, it has high instances of human-wildlife conflict in the surrounding GMAs. There's low tourism development, which leads to low economic benefits from wildlife to the local communities. There's high rates of biodiversity, and it's home to a small population of reintroduced black rhino. I used a mixed methods approach where I conducted 69 semi-structured interviews that included both open and closed-ended questions, as well as activities like free listing, where individuals openly named as many wildlife species that fell under a particular category, pile sorting, where they use the cards shown in this picture here to sort different wildlife into piles based on different categories, and ranking, where they use the same cards to rank wildlife species on a continuum from low to high, particularly focused on the severity and frequency of harm caused by those animals. The general results show that wildlife costs are common in this area. Approximately 57% of respondents had experienced crop raiding in the past year. There were 2 human fatalities in the region in the past year, one from an elephant and one from a snake bite, as well as approximately 40% of individuals experiencing livestock predation, mostly from leopards, birds of prey, and smaller cats. Yet people generally liked local wildlife. While disliked species were generally not tolerated, species that were liked may or may not be tolerated by the same individual. And people were willing to tolerate even wildlife species that they found very harmful. Looking at results from the free list, here I show the highest salient scores, where salience is a mixture of how many people included that species on their list, as well as how high on the list it was included by that individual. And asterisks denote species that ended up on both lists by different people. So the most liked species were elephant, duiker, which is a small antelope, and buffalo. The least liked were elephant, bush pig, and lion. And the reasons for liking or disliking any of these species varied greatly across participants and across species. Looking at species that were considered harmful or beneficial, it was a little more clear in terms of reasoning, and you can see that the top 5 beneficial species line up very well with the big 5, which are elephant, rhinoceros, buffalo, lion, and leopard. These are species that are considered particularly important for tourism and trophy hunting throughout Africa. And the species considered most harmful are also the ones most likely to be caught raiding crops or killing livestock. For pile sorting, there was unanimous agreement that impala and zebra were not harmful and elephants were harmful, yet the other species were considered harmful or not harmful for different reasons by different participants. Most importantly, tolerance by species. In terms of tolerance, I asked this indirectly by having participants classify animals into 2 piles based on a willingness to live with more of them in their area or fewer of them in the area. And there was no unanimous agreement, but in general, zebra, duiker, and impala, another antelope, were tolerated, while snakes and crocodiles were not tolerated. For this discussion, since we have limited time, let's focus on elephants as an example. You may have noticed that elephants had the highest salient score for each free list, like, dislike, harmful, and beneficial. 100% of participants considered elephants harmful in the pile sorting activity. They were ranked very high in terms of severity and frequency of crop raiding. Approximately 50% of participants had personally experienced crop raiding by elephants in the past year. Yet 32% of people were willing to tolerate more elephants in their area. And this included both individuals who had and had not experienced crop raiding in the past year. When elephants came up in conversation, the respondents often paused the interview to give me more information, explaining how elephants are a very big problem because they even kill people. They told me a lot about instances of harm and damage caused by elephants. They also made comments like, although elephants bring problems, they also bring benefits to the community. And people often express this complexity in both liking and disliking elephants and recognizing that they bring benefits and harm. So there was often a pause before participants determined which pile to even sort elephants in terms of willingness to tolerate them or not. In conclusion, not just with elephants, but in general, people liked local wildlife and were willing to tolerate even species they considered harmful. Tolerance is highly complex. While attitudes, knowledge, costs, and benefits all impact tolerance, it's not a direct and clear-cut relationship. There's also other factors such as fear, spiritual connections, superstitions, and cultural values that came up as being very important in terms of liking or disliking species, as well as tolerating them. Respondents definitely understood the potential value of trophy species very well, even though they have not received very many economic benefits from wildlife to date. And finally, efforts to reduce costs may not directly improve tolerance, as people's tolerance was not strictly based on cost and benefit. Finally, for conservation recommendations, it's very important to reevaluate our assumptions and assess the local context before implementing interventions. We need to broaden our focus beyond just costs and benefits to include other aspects like cultural norms, spiritual values, perceptions, and more. Education campaigns focused on the potential value of wildlife are likely effective at increasing tolerance in the short term, as we see in this study. And most importantly, it's the local people who are the ones that have to live with wildlife, and they need to determine how they're going to be able to tolerate living with wildlife. So as conservationists, we need to find out what's going on and see how we can support this relationship and this coexistence between people and wildlife in these shared spaces. Thank you so much for listening to my presentation. And thank you to everyone from Mukunkule who helped support my research. The Frankfurt Zoological Society provided logistical support, and the Center for African Studies that provided financial support. Thank you again.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Leandra, for the wonderful talk. I'm here to discuss the paper, Human-Dog Relationships Across Communities Surrounding Ranomafana and Andasibe-Mantadia National Parks, Madagascar. It looks at the relationships and dynamics of the coexistence of humans and dogs across several communities rurally located within and around Ranomafana, RNP now onwards, and Andasibe-Mantadia National Parks, AMNP now onwards, which are two of Madagascar's flagship protected areas. Madagascar is a global hotspot for biodiversity, home to a mammalian fauna that is not only diverse but also highly threatened. Worldwide, dogs are one of the most abundant carnivores that are invasive, threatening ecosystems and native wildlife. Large populations of free-roaming dogs live on the island, which also makes it a conservation priority. Yet, very little is known about human-dog relationships and their effects on the local ecosystems. We included 8 communities around RNP and 11 around AMNP in eastern Madagascar. All of these communities were rural, with high rates of poverty and large disease burdens, low levels of education, and predominantly dependent on subsistence agriculture. Their economies are significantly dependent upon wildlife tourism. Dog owners at these sites rarely, if ever, owned or used leashes for dogs, and most of the dogs could roam freely. Domestic dogs either lived inside the home or lived within a fenced area near the home. Traditional beliefs tend to influence people that live in communities closest to the biodiverse rich habitats in Madagascar. Such communities that live near and within these national parks have a higher number of taboos, known as FADI locally, linked to wild species. In addition, both RNP and AMNP are home to some of the highest levels of biodiversity in Madagascar and contain some of its most endangered wild species. Free mobile veterinary clinics were set up by the Mad Dog Initiative, a local trap, neuter, vaccinate, return organization, and consenting adults that brought their dogs for free spay-neuter services or vaccinations were surveyed after seeking permission from the village president, mayor, and elders. We only observed domestic dogs, that is those owned, spending majority of their time confined and acquiring all or most of their food from their owner, and free roaming dogs, that is those owned by one or more individuals or families, spending majority of their time unconfined, roaming freely away from their owner and acquiring some or most of their food from a source other than the owner. Some of the important findings were as follows. The average number of dogs per household was 3.23 with a standard deviation of 2.75 for AMNP and 1.55 with a standard deviation of 1.21 for RNP. Reasons for dog ownership were diverse, with the two most commonly cited reasons being instrumental, that is protection, 64.4% at AMNP, 52% at RNP, and hunting, 1.2% at AMNP and 1% RNP. Also, emotional uses such as companionship accounted for 8.2% at AMNP and 12.1% at RNP. Whereas most dogs around AMNP, 52.3%, slightly fewer around RNP, 42.8%, traveled one or more days into the forest with their owners. In both locations, the dogs killed a variety of domestic animals such as chicken, duck, pigs, other dogs and cats, and wild animals such as mice, snakes, rats, tenrecs, wild birds such as pigeon and quail, frogs, wild cats, hedgehog, bats, and fossa as well. While there were 38 reported predation events involving domestic animals across AMNP, there were 31 across RNP. For both the locations, there was a statistically significant association between the location of the community and whether or not owned dogs killed domestic animals. Additionally, whereas the community's location around RNP was significantly associated with the type of domestic animal killed, around AMNP it wasn't. There were 329 and 206 predation events involving wild animals around AMNP and RNP respectively. Around AMNP, there was a significant association between location of the community and whether or not owned dogs killed wild animals, but not around RNP. Community location around AMNP mattered to how individuals and their families felt about free roaming dogs in their community. Dog owners around AMNP 326 or 94% and RNP 202 or 88% said they would access free vet care made available to their owned dogs, including spay-neuter services. With respect to dogs hunting wildlife, since hunting within protected areas is illegal, survey respondents may have been hesitant to provide complete information for fear of incriminating themselves or being negatively judged by their community. In some parts of Madagascar, dogs have been used for hunting lemurs and Perrier's sifakas. Thus, the number of residents who hunt with their dogs may be higher than what we found. Similarly, the number of owners reporting that their dogs had killed domestic animals may be underestimated, as respondents may avoid reporting that their pet killed a neighbor's livestock. Fossa, an endemic cat-like mammal that is unique to Madagascar and its top predator, were also killed by dogs. Previous studies of human attitudes towards fossa indicate that many people view them negatively because they were perceived threats to poultry and small livestock due to fatty that they resemble dogs and consume the remains of villagers' ancestors. Previously, it has been seen that dogs have been trained to kill fossas in retaliation for the consumption of their poultry. It is quite possible that fossa deaths caused by dogs were either unreported or underreported by their owners because fossa are an endangered and protected species under the IUCN. Although the majority of owners across both sites negatively perceived free-roaming dogs, dog owners reported providing care and companionship to their own dogs that included a willingness to participate in veterinary care. This behavior is consistent with previous research amongst Australians as well as Americans. Human attitudes towards and relationships with dogs in Madagascar are diverse and varied and need to be understood before implementing targeted control or management solutions. People's perception of dogs, population level effects of dogs, predatory behavior towards domestic animals and wildlife, how dogs interact with wildlife habitats and protected lands, and dog behavior are particularly important considerations when planning any kind of conservation effort in Madagascar. Our results inform the complex and understudied human-dog relationships in rural landscapes of the developing world and highlight the negative impacts of free-roaming dogs on native wildlife, and make recommendations to mitigate them in one of the world's most important biodiversity hotspots. Thank you, thank you, and below are my references.
Hi, everyone. My name is Tierney Szymanski, and I am a master's student at the University of Florida in the Department of Geography, and I'm studying the effects of governance, type, and scale on community conservation in Southern Africa. For this study, I looked at scale and participation in community-based natural resource management, or CBNRM communities in Southern Africa, based on the theoretical arguments and principles for participatory face-to-face community governance proposed by leading theoreticians Ostrom and Murphy. Community conservation has been implemented and seen globally in Asia and Latin America, in addition to Southern Africa. But these projects are often subject to elite capture, and there's insufficient debate about democratic structures and involving the local communities in management and decision-making. CBNRM establishes institutions with an emphasis on property rights, markets, and community organization to govern otherwise ungoverned spaces. The absence of these institutions leads to poverty and environmental misuse, including global losses of wildlife. CBNRM is an economic approach to the allocation of resources, including wildlife, and it aims to enable high-value wild resources to compete fairly with lower value domestic species in the global economy, while also empowering local communities as landowners and managers through the acquisition of rights and improved governance through participatory and informed democracy. It's being implemented worldwide with varying degrees of success and aims to give the stewardship of natural resources back to the communities that live alongside them. The leading scholars, Ostrom and Murphy, both emphasize face-to-face democracy, yet little attention is paid to genuine accountable participation when CBNRM is implemented, beyond the establishment of committees and annual general meetings. In Southern Africa specifically, CBNRM has often pursued a set of aspirational conditions defined by Murphy, and several of Murphy's principles link cost to benefits and incorporate the economic allocation of resources to higher values. Like Ostrom, Murphy emphasizes the political organization of society to govern CBNRM, especially local face-to-face participation, as well as providing nested hierarchies. This figure from Child 2019 shows Ostrom's Principle 3 listed as 2 in the center of the list, as well as Murphy's Principles of Scale on the bottom left. Participatory governance is emerging as a key component for successful CBNRM. Despite a strong emphasis on participatory governance, though, it's rarely reflected in projects and programs around the world. Most CBNRM ends up being committee-based and reflects a representational form of governance characterized by a few elected individuals making decisions for the whole community. Both Ostrom and Murphy implicitly refer to participatory governance structures, with inclusive decision-making by all people impacted by decisions through face-to-face governance structures in small communities like villages. For this study, we utilized the governance dashboard surveys that examined attitudes towards wildlife, governance, and the implementation of CBNRM practices using questions about demographics, accountability, decision-making, knowledge of rights, knowledge of conservancy finances, trust regarding financial decisions, attitudes towards leaders, and overall satisfaction with the conservancy. The governance dashboard surveys were collected from 17 CBNRM communities between 2007 and 2009 from Botswana, Namibia, Zimbabwe, and Zambia. Some questions used a Likert scale and others were yes-no questions, such as the examples on the screen. This data for the study was provided by Dr. Shylock Mwangwa, and I combined these data into a single database, analyzing 912 completed questionnaires from 17 survey locations, which will be seen on the next slide. During the initial survey process, the 17 selected communities were chosen based on a variety of factors, including convenience, accessibility, how easy one could get to the community based off of existing infrastructure, existing relationships with the community, and willingness to work with outsiders long term. They also were picked based on existing connections and funding in the region. Following the trainings in Botswana, the case study regions were selected with all of them being functional and having existing and active CBNRM. So they were holding meetings in some form and had money both flowing in and out of the communities. The selected communities are comprised of both single village communities, which are blue on the map, and multi-village communities, which are orange on the map, and reflect both participatory and representational governance structures. The dependent variable for this study was the community members' overall satisfaction with the Conservancy, and the independent variables included a variety of measures such as attendance at meetings, knowledge of rights, involvement in election process, and trust. Some of the independent variables chosen were dichotomous, and others were a 5-point Likert scale that were converted. This is a list of selected governance dashboard survey questions used in the analysis, as well as the unit they were recorded in. These questions include ones regarding financial trust, participation, knowledge of rights, location of the villages, and scale. A logistic regression was used to run the analysis with an initial model run with all variables included, and then dredged to compare all possible combinations of variables. This allowed for us to find the best combination of the variables to predict overall satisfaction with the Conservancy. All relevant interaction terms were tested, with one being statistically significant and included in the best fit model. The variables were tested for multicollinearity using the VIF factor, and an odds ratio was also calculated for each of the predictor variables. The odds ratio represents the effect of predictor variables on the likelihood of the survey participant viewing the Conservancy in a favorable manner. The best fit logistic regression model has multiple statistically significant predictors of overall satisfaction with the Conservancy. Some of the most statistically significant predictors related to financial trust, such as, do you trust the Conservancy leadership to manage and account for your finances? Do you have the right to demand for a meeting and or an explanation? Do you have the right to make decisions on the use of Conservancy money? Survey participants who trusted the leaders to manage and account for their finances were around 8 times more likely to rate the Conservancy in a favorable manner. The analysis to compare variation across countries was done utilizing dummy variables, with Zambia, Botswana, and Zimbabwe becoming dummy variables in the country category and all being compared against Namibia. Namibia performed the best of the other countries, with everyone else performing slightly worse in terms of satisfaction. When comparing Namibia to Zambia, the respondents in Zambia are about 0.5 times less satisfied with the Conservancy than the respondents in Namibia. In Botswana, they're about 0.4 times less satisfied than those in Namibia, and in Zimbabwe, they're around 0.2 times less satisfied with the Conservancy than the respondents in Namibia. Single village was also a statistically significant predictor of overall satisfaction, with participants in single villages being almost 2 times more likely to rate the Conservancy in a favorable manner. Single village was included in all of the top 5 models and was statistically significant in each. Attending the AGM was a statistically significant predictor of overall satisfaction, but the combination of attending the AGM and having the right to make decisions on the use of Conservancy money resulted in a slight decrease in the level of satisfaction. The respondents who attended the AGM were more likely to rate the Conservancy in a favorable manner, but this effect was countered by having the right to make decisions on the use of Conservancy money. In this figure, single villages outperform multi-villages on all questions except for attending the AGM. However, when looking at the villages without Zimbabwe, single villages outperform on every question. The single village governance dashboard surveys collected in Zimbabwe were done at a time of considerable political unrest that some have suggested affected CBNRM and governance, which is why we wanted to see the impact removing Zimbabwe would have on the performance of single villages. There was a strong overall performance of Zambia and Botswana's single villages compared to multi-villages, including Namibia's strong performing multi-villages. Botswana's single village had the highest percentage of yes respondents to the questions and many of the governance indicators, and had the highest levels of financial trust and transparency between all countries looked at. The results of the study support our hypothesis that variability in satisfaction of community members with CBNRM in Southern Africa is affected by the enabling government, scale, and also the perception of governance indicators such as trust and participation. These cannot be ignored when looking at future implementation of CBNRM.
Thank you everyone for those presentations. We will now move into some questions and discussion. So if anyone in the audience has questions, please go ahead and post those using the Q&A function in Zoom, and make sure to note who you are addressing in the question. And we do have one question already. What kind of benefits did people identify from elephants? I assume that one's for me since I talked about elephants. So I will go ahead and answer that quickly. In my research, a lot of the participants that I talked to mentioned cultural and spiritual ties to elephants, and that elephants were really important for those reasons. A lot of people also mentioned economic reasons that elephants could be beneficial, and they have trophy hunting sometimes in the area. And if an elephant is killed or another trophy species, then 20% of the revenue that the government gets from the trophy hunting permit goes back to the local communities. So in the past, there was an elephant that was killed quite a while ago, and money was given to the communities, and they used it to help fund one of their primary schools. So that was something that a lot of people brought up, and the idea and the potential that in the future they could still make money off of elephants potentially. And again, if anyone has questions, you can go ahead and add them in the Q&A. Otherwise, I will go back to kind of a general question for all of us. I know we brought up some individual case studies and some larger regional case studies that all talk about different aspects of human-wildlife conflict and coexistence. So I will ask my other presenters what they think some of the main challenges and opportunities for human-wildlife coexistence are throughout Africa.
Yeah, thanks, Leandra, for that question. I think that's quite a relevant one. And yeah, as far as opportunities and challenges are concerned, I definitely feel a lot based on, I think one of the common themes that came out from our talks was the importance of culture and the understanding of wildlife in or people's perceptions about wildlife and conflict, which relates to levels of tolerance and things like that. So I definitely feel one of the challenges would be to try and understand these human-animal relationships and people's perceptions in greater detail in the future. As for example, related to my talk, research has shown that basically the degree of association between dogs and humans has an effect of how far away from their owners do they foray, as well as how frequently do they foray into forests, which is where we suspect most of these wildlife killings and interactions are happening. So in the future, possibly things like a lot more camera capture techniques, as well as trying to assess the guts of these dogs for the diets that they're consuming, I think might be helpful indicators of the extent of predation if that's going on.
Yeah, Akil, that was a great answer. I think for me, one of the things I looked at in these communities, they were all outside of protected areas, and the overlap of communities and wildlife as populations are beginning to continue to grow has been one of the things that we thought is going to be the most challenging. But from my work, it did show that enabling environment is a big factor on success of a conservancy. And I would like to look more about how national policy has an impact on these regions as well, instead of just at the local scale. Because I think national policy guides it as well.
Thank you. You both bring up some excellent points. And I think, as Akil mentioned, throughout this conference, really, I see a general theme of how important it is to understand local people who are living with wildlife. And, you know, as outside researchers, that can often be challenging. and as practitioners, but it's so important that we take time to really understand what's going on the ground. And as much as we'd like to have some large Band-Aid solution that we can apply to all of Africa or all of the tropics, that really doesn't seem likely from a lot of the research and a lot of the conversations we're having throughout this conference. So I definitely agree that it's so important to understand the local context and really dive into what's going on in that specific community before trying to solve any issues. But then also, like you mentioned, tyranny, there is a lot going on at the national and international level that's also influencing what happens at the local scale. So just this importance of both understanding the fine scale, what's going on at the local level, but also how that interacts with the global scale and as well as the national scale, and how those are connected and maybe not connected is so important as we think about human wildlife coexistence, and how that's even going to be possible. So with that as a starter, a follow-up question for both of you is, and I think you started to touch on this, but maybe you can expand more on what specific next steps you see for researchers and practitioners, both in your study regions and across the tropics.
Yeah, so definitely, I feel like I sort of mentioned, uh, one of the limitations of this study definitely was um, in terms of exactly knowing, although previous research does show that, you know, um, dogs can have negative influences on wildlife, on surrounding wildlife, like predation. They can harass them, they can transmit diseases, or they can compete with their sort of niches, environmental niches. So one of the things that definitely could help might be using more sort of camera capture techniques, sort of, which can basically give you more of an idea of where these dogs are actually spending time away from their owners. What are they doing in these forested regions, or and how are they interacting with wildlife? So yeah, I think that could be one way forward.
For myself, there's a few things that I would like to do with this research into the future. One thing that I've talked about with some of the people involved is, since the surveys were taken between 2007 and 2009, is going back and reevaluating each of the communities. I know at the time there were a few single villages that since then have formed together to make multi-villages, and then in the opposite, there's been a few multi-villages that have broken down into smaller villages. And I'd like to see how that has impacted the Conservancy over a period of time, and then also dive into the question of enabling environments a little bit more, and look at how wildlife ownership, land tenure, governmental policy, histories, how factors like that influence conservation, and then, if possible, tie in an economic element in these communities and see how much they're getting from their resources, and look at the potential value of each of the areas.
Great, thank you so much for your suggestions on some of the next steps. And I would like to reiterate that, this case study that Akil brought is about dogs in Madagascar, but there are dogs all over the world, and we know that they have an impact on wildlife populations, as do domestic cats, and domestic dogs as well. And that's something that, just like the human population is growing and continues to like their pets, this is likely to continue to be an issue throughout the world, and something that definitely needs to be looked at, not just in Madagascar, but throughout Africa and throughout the world. And similarly, I think a lot of the research findings from my study that show really how local people actually like wildlife. And we often have this perception in the US that we like exotic wildlife. We don't necessarily like the wildlife in our backyard. But what I found in Zambia is people like the wildlife that they live with, and they're actually somewhat willing to live with wildlife, even wildlife that cause problems, which is really encouraging to me. It sets this opportunity that we can build from there and find ways to allow them to live with wildlife while supporting their own livelihoods and their own health and safety. And that's something that I think is a very broad opportunity that should apply to really the continent and the world. And we're starting to see more evidence of that and how we can build on the idea of people actually liking and tolerating wildlife and reframing this as not all conflict, but actually opportunities for people and wildlife to survive and coexist in shared spaces. So I find that encouraging. And like Tierney mentioned, there's also so much that can happen at the national level and international level in terms of social, economic, biological, ecological, just so much that's going on that we really need to do a better job of understanding so we can try to influence this and encourage the coexistence of people and wildlife. I don't see any more questions for us today. So I think we will end a little bit early. I would like to thank our guest speakers again, Tierney Szymanski and Akhil Schersager. And thank you to all of our audience members who are joining us live and anyone who is watching this later. We really appreciate you. And you can continue to connect with us through the platform, find us, send us questions, email us. We're happy to answer them and continue to connect with anyone. Also, thank you to Juan Pablo and everyone else from ATBC who's working behind the scenes to make this session so wonderful. So thank you again to everyone, and we will close our session here.